We'll get started. We hired Casey back in July, and we had a job position opening. And she walked in one day and wanted tickets to a jazz concert that we were doing a fundraiser. And she goes, "Oh, and do you have a job here available?" And I said, "Yes, send me your resume today, right now." Because she said, "I just got a master's in museum studies." And I was like, are you kidding? You're kidding, right? So anyway, it just, from there on, it's been smooth sailing. It's been really wonderful having her on board. She's a real crackerjack at pretty much everything and could probably do my job better than I do it. But that's just, I'm just saying that she's very good at what she does, and we really love her. And one day, the one thing about Casey is she can be kind of quiet and down and, hidden, like it's really hard to find her, But, no, I'm being facetious. What I really love about Casey is she's got tons of energy and she's really outgoing and she loves talking to people, and that's exactly what we need here because we're about working with people and making things happen here. So I'm glad to have Casey on board to help achieve that mission. So without further ado, Casey went to Baylor, and she can talk about it, but she's going to give a presentation on her background. So everybody, welcome Casey Holmes.
I just got introduced as Casey Holmes. That's never happened before. I just got married like 6 weeks ago, so I'm still adjusting. That's the thing. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Casey Holmes. I'm the new resource coordinator, but like Cheryl said, they hired me in July, so I'm still kind of green, but I'm adjusting, and I just love my job here. This is perfect. This is exactly where I want to be, and how it worked out me getting here. Like Cheryl said, it just kind of all fell together, and it was really great. I want to thank Rich for letting me do this. He was kind of crunched last week, and I said, "Can I please do this brown bag? I know it's last minute." He's like, "Yes, go for it." So thank you, Rich. Thank you, Cheryl, for hiring me. Thank you, Melika, for being my awesome support system. You're great. And yeah, thanks for coming today. Everything that you need to know about me, because Rich said that he was going to title this program Meet Casey, and I was like, oh, now I have to talk about myself too. I can't just talk about the Josephy Center. Everything you need to know about me is on this slide. So I grew up in central Illinois on a dairy farm. And from the get-go, my brother and I were these two power duos of adventure. We were going to get out of this small town. We were going to go places and do things. And my parents were very supportive of that. They both grew up farming. And they said, do what you love, even if you don't get paid like 6-7 figures for it. And that stuck, because I work in nonprofits, and Austin's an actor in LA. So we're both doing what we love, and it just worked out really well. I got my bachelor's degree at Eureka College near Peoria, Illinois. Ronald Reagan went there. That's the only thing anybody knows about it. My degree was in history and political science with a minor in religion and philosophy. So while I was there, I was part of the Ronald Reagan Leadership Fellowship, and they paid for me to go study abroad at Oxford, which was fun and nerdy and felt like Hogwarts. While I was there, I studied the history of the Reformation and the philosophy of the Enlightenment, which was a lot of history and a lot of reading. It was only 2 classes, but I was spending 8 hours a day in the library just reading all the time. So when I wasn't doing that, I joined a women's rowing crew, and that was the best decision I ever made. That was so much fun. I was also a research assistant for the chairwoman of the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society, so I got to read the Chronicles of Narnia like 4 times while I was there, and that was fun. And then after that, I took a year off and went and lived in Missoula with my aunt for a year before I went to graduate school. That was the first time I'd ever lived west of the Mississippi. So I'm meeting a lot of folks around here who've never been east of the Mississippi, and that's a little weird for me. But that was my first step west, and I loved it. I fell in love with the mountains. I fell in love with the scenery. And I'm not sure if here in Joseph you would consider that the Pacific Northwest, but I did. So it was great. It was beautiful. And I very reluctantly, under extreme protest, moved down to Texas to go to graduate school. It was like leaving a beautiful spring afternoon in a hammock to go live in an oven for 2 years. It was horrible. Some folks say that they weren't born in Texas, but they got there as fast as they could. I went down there, got my degree, and got out as fast as I could. If you're from Texas, I'm sorry, but I just could not take the heat. It was not great. So then I moved out here, I married that guy in September, and now I'm here. And it's been a real whirlwind, but I really love what I do, and I'm really glad to be living in Joseph and Willson County. It's a great place, and everybody here is so kind and so welcoming. So thank you to all of you who have made me feel like I belong here. Now, my degree at Baylor is essentially what I'm going to ultimately talk about. This is going to be a great mishmash of me and museum history and talking about museum education. But if you get nothing else out of this program, what I hope you understand is that museums and galleries, like the Josephy Center, from our size of an institution, all the way to the Met or the Smithsonian, they are all uniquely equipped to reach people and to educate people. And it's only in the last 30 or 40 years that education has really become the focus and the mission behind museums and galleries. And that's new. I think that looking at child education theory and learning types, how different people learn and how different people engage with information is not new. That's been developing for centuries, but museums didn't actually start to harness that and really study it until the 60s. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how museums have developed over time and what they were missing, and then what happened in the 60s to make them suddenly think, wow, we should start using education instead of just recreation as our mission. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. When people hear that I'm from Central Illinois, where there's no museums anywhere except Chicago, they're like, why did you want to do this? How did you get into this? And I've used this answer in interviews. I'm being completely serious. I wanted to work in a museum because I wanted to be this guy when I was little. I grew up loving Indiana Jones. There are tons of paleontologists out there who are paleontologists because they love Jurassic Park. I wanted to be an archaeologist and work in museums because I loved Indiana Jones. And I did the archaeology thing. It was difficult, but it was fun. But after I dug stuff up, I wanted to label it and tell people about it. I wanted to put it in display cases. I didn't want to just put it in a Ziploc bag and hand it off to somebody else. So that's why I chose to, I still have the whip and the hat, but I'm not exactly Indiana Jones. I'm what happens after Indiana Jones. So going to Baylor, like I said, it was living in an oven for 2 years. But every building on campus is kept at 50 degrees all year round. So you had to wear like 3 layers to work, and then you walked out the door and shed all of them because it was 100 degrees and 100% humidity outside. I went to work in the gray brick building over here. It was called the Texas Collection, Special Collections Library and Archives. Basically, it's the largest holding space for historic documents in the state of Texas, other than the university in Austin. And we worked with a huge collection of Civil War letters, family histories, church histories. I did a lot of church histories, census records, tons of old maps, and then more Civil War letters, because everybody would come in and say, I want to see a letter from the Civil War. And I would say, we have 45,000. Which one would you like? And they were a pain to dig up, but they were really wonderful. Some of them were love letters. Some of them were just talking about anything except war, and they were really wonderful to read. So I got to nerd out and then also enjoy reading the content. That's where I worked. I went to class at the Mayborn Museum Complex, which is this red brick building over here. It does look like Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. That is because the director who was in charge of building it, it's only 10 years old, when they asked him, what would you like it to look like? He pulled a nickel out of his pocket, turned it over and said, that's what I want it to look like. So that's what we got, was what's on the back of the nickel. So my degree is pretty unique when it comes to content and how it embraces museum studies. There are other universities that offer master's degrees in it, but it's mostly a bachelor's degree or sometimes just a minor degree. It covers 3 particular areas: museum administration, museum education, and museum collections. Remember, I wanted to be Indiana Jones, so I was all about museum collections when I first started. Now that I'm at the Josephy Center, I'm finding that I'm using a lot more of my administration and education coursework, which is great because I have the education to do that, and I'm starting to fall in love with that. Other universities that have this program tend to focus on one area and not all 3, and I think that's what makes Baylor special. George Washington University in DC offers a great museum program, but they only focus on administration. They only offer education as an elective, and they don't do hardly anything with collections management. UNC Chapel Hill does a lot with education, but you don't get any administration or collections management training. Wow, collections management really gets the shaft. Okay, well that's why I went to Baylor, because they require you to do all three. My first year as a graduate student, I took Admin 101, Museum Ed 101, and Collections Management 101. You have to take all three. And that makes us uniquely marketable when it comes to looking for jobs in museums. Because let's face it, most museums and galleries in America are tiny institutions with like 3 people on staff and they do everything. So you have to be trained to do everything. Not all of us are the Smithsonian or the Met, where we have 1 million people doing tons of very minute, detailed jobs. And I think that's what really prepared me for this job, was that I had a really well-rounded education in all 3 areas. Just to give you just a brief rundown of each of these areas, museum administration focused on a lot of staff and board relations, how to work with a board, how not to work with a board. Also focused on building plans, looking at city codes and how that affects historic preservation, when you want to make changes to a historic house or move a historic house, build parking lots, things like that. It also focused on budget planning. So we actually had a museum that started up in Waco, and we wrote a budget plan for them while we were there. The police department said, we want to put a museum right in our station. And we're like, where? Because you have no room. And where are you going to put this? So we drew up a building plan for them to kind of rearrange their whole station to make room for a museum. And then we also focused on writing them a marketing plan, which included a budget, launching Facebook and Twitter accounts for them, giving samples for crisis PR, which they had done in the past, but they'd never done crisis PR in social media. It's very different. And if you remember in the news, there was this shooting incident at Twin Peaks. There was a bunch of Harley guys, and there was this massive shootout in Waco, and we were writing all of this crisis PR for them while that was going on. So they actually used a good bit of it, and they're still using our budget and our building strategy for how to incorporate the museum into their station. So that's fun. We can, 5 years down the road, we can say we helped build this cute little museum. Museum education, I'm going to talk a lot about that today, just exploring all different kinds of learning theories and exploring how different people engage with information, whether they're reading it or whether they're playing with clay. There's all different ways that you can encounter information and how you process it. We wrote programming for kids pre-K through high school. We did all kinds of fun, hands-on stuff with kids in museum education. Museum collections was my favorite because we got to learn how to stabilize objects. That's what we're doing at this table over here. When objects are not on display, you have to make sure they're being stored properly, make sure the temperature, humidity, light exposure, all those things are monitored and regulated. When you live in Texas, you get a lot of bugs. So there's how to do integrated pest management was part of that. And then that kind of ruined museums for us because now whenever I go to a museum, this is what I do. I don't necessarily see the objects, or when I go into a gallery. When I first walked in here, we had a great show up, but I didn't see any of it because I was looking at what kind of hooks they had. And I was looking at where the lights were pointed, and I was trying to figure out where the thermostat was going to be set in a room like this to allow for the heat from the lights. So that's how my mind thinks now. It's kind of like if you've ever been in a play and you don't really see a stage the same again because all you see is the guys who are trying to move the set and run the lights and run the music. So that was kind of just a brief intro to my degree, and now I want to share with you how it applies to the Josephy Center, because everything that I've talked to you about now has been with the word museum, and the Josephy Center is what, if your average Joe walked in here, they would call it an art gallery, but our actual title is the Josephy Center for Arts and Culture, and that name gives us a much broader mission. We're not just displaying art, we're teaching art. And we're talking to local artists about programming. We're looking into music and theater and all these other things. So I want to make sure that it's clear how my degree fits in with working here. According to the American Alliance of Museums, which was the American Association Museums 5 years ago, so we had to learn the new name, and it's confusing for everyone. This is the definition of museum: an organization and an organized and permanent nonprofit institution, essentially educational or aesthetic in purpose, with professional staff which owns or utilizes tangible objects, cares for them, and exhibits them to the public on some regular schedule. Now, that is kind of a broad definition, and that encompasses, I think, a lot of institutions, including the Josephy Center, that we wouldn't normally think of as a museum. I think the kicker that makes it fit for the Josephy Center is this, which owns or utilizes, because we don't really have a permanent art collection here now. Cheryl's been having me work on a grant for us to kickstart that, but we don't have a permanent collection here. Everything that comes through this gallery is on loan, which is why I write a lot of loan agreements. The Smithsonian has objects coming out of their ears. You know, they don't usually rent or loan things unless it's for a special exhibit. Actually, heard this stat the other day and it blew my mind. The Smithsonian has so many objects in its underground storage facility that it has a set of volunteers that every year on January 1, they get an inventory list. This is everything we have, this is where it is, this is where it should be, check and make sure it's there. And they start that project on January 1. It takes them the entire year to check every single object in the Smithsonian collection. And then on January 1 of the next year, they get the same list. And they start back over at the beginning and they just go through the whole thing again, because so many of their objects are moving to other institutions or moving in exhibits, but that's how much stuff they have. And then you've got the Bob Bullock Texas State Historic Museum, which is in Austin. They have a 185,000 square foot building full of objects, and they don't own any of it because it's all on loan. It's all objects that they get from other places. They might be long-term loans, but they don't own any of it. And that's why they can call themselves a museum, because they utilize tangible objects and display them on a regular schedule, even if they don't own them. Does that make sense? And that's why Josephy qualifies as a museum, in my mind anyway. So even though it's not a museum by name, it does fit the definition. And I think that's why I am so excited to be able to take my work and apply it to what I do here. So moving into the museum education piece and how we can reach different kinds of people here at the Josephy Center, I'm going to go way, way back and talk about the history of museums and the history of art galleries and kind of give you a brief picture of how that's changed over time. Okay, I wasn't kidding when I said way back. The Library of Alexandria. I think we've all heard of the library, but not so many of us have heard of the museum that went with it. The Greeks really liked their paintings, the Romans really liked their sculptures, and they would display them for public viewing. Now, public is a very loose term, and we're not exactly sure how they defined it, but throughout this presentation, you're going to see how different civilizations have defined open to the public, and I think that's going to really increase your appreciation for the Josephy Center and what we mean when we say open to the public. We've all heard of, in the Middle Ages, how the monks and the clergy and the nuns were the ones collecting historic documents. Libraries at monasteries in Europe are beautiful. If you're ever traveling, be sure to check them out. They really started to hoard the paper objects, which is kind of more focused in the archive than the museum. Museums tend to be object-focused, archives are paper-focused, or libraries. But it all at this point is kind of melded together. People are collecting old things, whether it's paper, objects, books, whatever. They're collecting them and trying to make them available for the public. In the Renaissance, every palace, every home of a wealthy person started accumulating art. And I think we started with art because human nature, since the beginning, has had a natural instinct for collecting and appreciating beauty. We want to collect it, keep it, but we also want to share it with people. And I think that's where this first starts. Cabinets of Curiosities were the first real opening of collections for people to come see. They were in private collections. They were just tucked away in people's homes. They were very crowded. As you can see, oh, it's all blurry. We've got all these cases right here full of stuff. And you can see right here, it's just this room that's packed full of stuff. And it's art, it's scientific research materials, it's anthropology materials, it's cultural evidence. And it's all smashed together in this one space. And there's no labels, and there's no arrangement. So there's no chronology. You can't go in and say, this is the oldest piece, this is the newest piece, and see what's in between. All the science and anthropology, everything's all mixed together. So it's very confusing. And when people would open up their homes to show this, they were the only ones who knew what it was. So you had to be invited to come and see these. You had to know the person who had them, and you kind of just had to sit and listen to this one person tell you about every single object. Wasn't really open to the public. This picture over here is from the History Gallery at the Mayborn, where I took my classes, and we had cabinets of curiosity in there just to show people the history of museums, but we had digital screens in each of those, so you could figure out what the object was if you wanted to. But ideally, these were just kind of smashed together. And my cohort came up with this phrase, just having a collection does not a museum make. Because you're not really open to the public, you're not sharing that information with very many people, and the information you're sharing is very limited and confusing because it's all smashed together. So looking at how this applies to art, art was displayed very similarly. The first real collection of art displayed in this way was in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And what do you notice about the art in these pictures?
It covers the walls.
They're crooked! That's a good one. It covers the walls, floor to ceiling. And not many of them are labeled. You don't know who they are. This picture's a little blurry, but it's still kind of a certain caliber of society that's coming to see this art. It's not open to the public. It's only certain people who are allowed to come and see these private collections. And I think when we look at that, and then we look at the space we're in, this is very different. We have labels for each piece. They are spaced out so you can appreciate each piece, especially with Jacob's pieces here. Some of them are very similar. And if you put them all close together, they kind of run together. They kind of all look the same, don't they? And you lose the vision for each one. You lose the unique beauty of each piece if you display it with too many other pieces like we do here. So that's why we do one piece here, one over there, so that you can kind of get this perspective of how each one is uniquely beautiful. And then we actually give you the information of what the piece is titled, who made it, when they made it, what it's made of, in your own language. Because when labels were first started being used in European museums, they were in Latin. And none of your public spoke Latin. So it was all, you still had to have a certain reading level and be a certain level of society in order to fully appreciate these museums. So now I'm going to move on to our own soil, onto the American story of museums. If you divide the history of America into 1770 to 1870, 1870 to 1970, then 1970 to 2016, you kind of see how museums develop. So it's kind of a weird arbitrary spacing, but bear with me. So this first century, 1770 to 1870, we kind of imagine as being all about democracy, right? Because we wanted to be different from Europe from the very beginning. And you would think that our museums would reflect that, but they didn't, because like the museums in Europe, they had very odd hours, their rules and their labels were all in Latin, they were kind of still these small private collections. In 1786, Charles Willson Peale started developing his museum in Philadelphia. Some of you have probably heard of Charles Willson Peale. He painted everybody in colonial America. Every young painting of George Washington you've ever seen is probably done by Charles Willson Peale. His collection had a lot of scientific pieces in it, a lot of cultural anthropology pieces in it. He liked taxidermy birds. He had over 5,000 taxidermy birds. And he did, a lot of his paintings were on display. And he also had a full-size taxidermied mastodon. I don't know where it is now. I'd really love to know, but I don't have a clue. But when it got too big, when the collection got too big for his house, he moved it onto the second floor of the Philadelphia State House, which we all know as, anybody? Independence Hall. So just a few short years after our founding fathers are signing the Declaration of Independence, we're moving a mastodon up those stairs in pieces. So that was actually the second public museum in Philadelphia. The first one was established a couple years before and it flopped. They had, like I said, they had really odd hours. They charged 50 cents for a ticket, which back then is kind of a lot. And then Charles Peale opened his up, and it was much more open. It had more regular hours, and he would gladly walk you through and tell you everything you wanted to know, more than you wanted to know about that mastodon. And about this time, we also start to see museums working with universities history societies and other organizations to do research. I think this surprises a lot of people because nowadays we imagine, some of us still imagine museums as just these holding tanks of old stuff. You know, they just have this stuff and it just sits there and I can go see it whenever. But especially in campus towns and even small town history museums, like the Loudoun County History Museum here in Joseph, people can go and use their collection to do research. And it first starts in the 1780s when people start to use museums as a place where they can do research. So moving into the 1870-1970 bracket, Reconstruction, the Industrial Revolution really launches museum activity. We see a lot of folks going to museums in this era. It just shoots way up until the Depression, like you see in my second point. Then it kind of staggers way off, and then it shoots way back up after we recover from that. So here are some of the museums that get established in this area: the American Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian, the Met. The World Expos in Philadelphia, Chicago, London, and Paris kind of kick off establishing museums. Any guesses which museum in Chicago is still there from the World Expo in 1893?
The Field.
The Field. Who said that? Nice. Good. Illinois. Thanks. And then art museums, especially in that area before the Depression. In the 1920s, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association establishes the first privately owned historic structure, and it's owned by an organization that's all women in George Washington's Mount Vernon. And then John D. Rockefeller establishes the first historic district at Colonial Williamsburg. Yes.
I hate to interrupt this, but how much of this is because of the robber barons and the fact that they had money and wanted to leave a legacy?
Sure. I think that there were major financial contributions made to establishing these museums, but we don't see very many personal collections going to these. The British Museum in London was started by one guy who had like 70,000 objects and 40,000 books and so much stuff. I think a lot of European museums were established from personal collections. In America, it's those guys giving money. They're not necessarily giving stuff, they're giving money. And I think that's exactly what Colonial Williamsburg was that Rockefeller had a lot of money and he did want to preserve a certain area, but he also establishes a few very unhistoric districts where he takes Edison's workroom and he picks it up and he moves it somewhere else and he starts establishing historic districts of just old historic houses that he picks up and moves. And that really kind of takes away the historic integrity of it. So he gave a lot of money to preserving history, but he didn't leave it where it was, like he did in Colonial Williamsburg.
And when did the Carnegie libraries all got built? That was, and they just flat out gave money.
They gave
towns.
They weren't actually part of the building process.
Pardon?
They weren't actually part of the building process, and they weren't donating books either. They're just giving money to establishing those kinds of
But I think
libraries.
they had there's a look of a Carnegie library. I don't doubt that they had some influence on it.
Yeah.
And they also did some, like Carnegie Mellon, the museums.
Right. And that's all at about this time.
Yeah.
Is when people start pouring money into museums, because there is a certain amount of prestige, and honor in donating to museums. You kind of see these very wealthy families giving money to museums because there's a certain prestige that comes with it. 2 questions before we move on. Any idea what might have really started the spike in people visiting museums at about the early 1900s? There's something really big that happens in the early 1900s. Transportation.
Pardon?
Transportation. Cars and public transit. The National Park Service is established in 1916 and people start taking family vacations to Yellowstone. People can actually start going to these museums. I missed one here. The children's museums in Brooklyn and Boston get established just about this time period, and kids could get on city buses and go and do science experiments at the Brooklyn Children's Museum. Fun thing about children's museums, they're the only museum in the industry that has its target audience in the title. Fun fact. There's also something else interesting about all of these museums that I have listed here. Do you guys notice anything about where they're located?
East Coast.
What'd you say?
East of the Mississippi.
East of the Mississippi and East Coast. And who is living on the East Coast in these big cities at about the 1900s and the late 1880s? A lot of immigrants, and let's just face it, a lot of poor, illiterate immigrants. So we've got the Polish, the Irish, the Italians, Germans filling these big cities, and these are the public that these museums are supposed to reach. But when all of these museums were established, they still required an admission fee. They were still only open 3 or 4 days a week. The Met was not a 7 days a week museum when it was first established. And their $25 donation is a donation now, but it wasn't always. And so again, even though we're moving into the 70s, museums were starting to become, free here and there, and they're having, wider hours, but we're still not quite as public as we think we are.
Was the Smithsonian from the get-go though free, or was that after it was turned over to the government? How did that
After it was turned over to the government, it became free. I do not remember. I used to know how much they charged for admission, but it wasn't until after it was turned over to the government that it was
And when was that?
free visit. I don't remember.
Early 1900s?
All right, last stage, 1971 to 2016. So it's right before this phase, but the 60s and 70s changed everything in America. A lot of you were there. 1968 was a mess. JFK, and then Martin Luther King, and then Kent State in 1970. Watergate came shortly after. We're just finishing, we're coming 20 years off of it, but we're just finishing up Korea. Vietnam doesn't wrap up till 75. There's protests everywhere. There's the civil rights movement. There's just a lot of major political, cultural changes going on in America. And when that happens, that's reflected in the museums. The perception of museums changes quite a bit in this time period. I just mentioned a few things going on. There's a lot of protests happening, but what big, invisible, giant being is being protested in the 70s? There's a big, besides Vietnam, what are we don't like the man. We don't like the establishment, and when we look at museums, they kind of look like the establishment at this point. They're kind of this uppity place that you go if you have the money and you have the leisure time. And I think that all of the things that were causing America to ask themselves, who are we? What are we doing? Why are we here? What are our priorities as a country? Museums started asking the same question. Who are we? What are we doing? What are our priorities? Who is our target audience? And how are we reaching them? So, like I said, it's right before this stage actually starts, but the Tax Reform Act of 1969 actually had a huge effect on museums. Any guesses how?
Tax.
Your donations were right.
Yeah. So this isn't quite when we become non-profit, when we become, what did you call it? You just said it. When you can start writing off your tax donations. This is tax deductible. There we go. Right. This isn't quite. This is about the time that started. But the big thing about this Reform Act is that this is when the IRS redefined museums as educational centers. Before then, museums were defined as recreational centers. Now they're educational, and we can start receiving funding, and we can start having donations based on our ability to educate. And that completely throws the museum industry for a loop. I think it was also in 1969, AAM, because it was the American Association of Museums then, publishes the Belmont Report, which makes a case for federal funding for education that goes on in museums. So suddenly we have a new priority as museums. It's not just keeping and holding stuff. It's not just having all of these big rooms full of old stuff that people can come and look at. It's how do we educate people effectively? How do we keep people interested? How do we make them feel good while they're here? And how do we teach them something while they're here? My museum education professor, Dr. Ellie Kasten, was a undergraduate in 1970. She was in her second year of undergraduate, getting her elementary education degree. And the museum industry really didn't know where it was going to get all of these educators that it suddenly needed. So they started pulling them from teachers, pulling them out of the classroom. All of these teachers had just been trained to work and teach in a classroom. And they are like, well, you're the educators we've got, we're going to put you in museums. And they found themselves in this very different environment, trying to teach with a huge collection rather than teach in a classroom. So she attended the 1973 AAM convention where they established the Education Committee. And that was a big deal because up until then, educators were like, we need to have a say at these conventions. We need to have a say in how museums are run, how they operate, what our priorities are as an institution, because we're educational centers now. We are supposed to educate, so you need to let us have a say at the conventions. And that's where they started having that say. It was in 1973. So as museums are starting to adjust to being education centers or being educational institutions instead of just holding tanks, the curators rioted, politely. But that we suddenly have this power struggle. Because before, when it was private collections and it was these cabinets of curiosity or these big floor-to-ceiling art galleries, who knew what the stuff was? The curator. Who knew where it came from or how old it was? The curator. They were the big man on campus. They did everything at the museum. And now, all of our funding, all of our mission statements are all based around education. We've got these high school teachers coming in thinking they own the place. So curators really had an identity crisis. And one of them, one from New York back in the 80s, wrote this article called "The Rumors of Our Death Have Been Greatly Exaggerated." And it was basically a white flag between curators and educators saying, we can work together. Because educators can't do anything without our collection, and our collection is useless without educators. So we have to find a way to communicate. And it's great because there's some really great case studies out there, because there are still museums that struggle with this. This is still, education museums is still a new enough concept. There are some very elderly, been around forever, know everything about that museum curator who is still struggling to hand over the reins to an educator. And so that was really a fun aspect of my degree was visiting museums, and you could pick out which curators were still a little curmudgeon-y about the fact that educators were doing show and tell with their old stuff. In 1998, AAM published this book, Museums, Places of Learning, and it outlines how education has established itself as the mission for museums and how we can make that work, both as curators and as educators. It's very short. If any of you are interested in that and how it works and how it's developed, please check it out on Amazon. I think this cost me $5. It's a really great read. And one of the things that it outlines very clearly is that people learn differently. Melika knows this. People learn differently. And if museums are going to be education spaces, we need to learn how to appeal to different learning types. The other thing we have to remember is that museums are full of people. They're not just full of static objects and these ominous bodies that come and look at them and then leave. Those ominous bodies are people, and they all bring in a lot of stuff with them when they walk through your front door. A couple of years ago, no, just this. When they published this, in the front page, it'll tell you that museums were getting 500 million visitors every year in America. That's much higher now. I went to the AAM website. That statistic is up to 850 million visitors to American museums every year. That is more than high school and college sports events and professional sports events and theme parks in America combined.
Really?
Yeah. And that's from the Met all the way down to the Josephy Center. People come to these. This is a big deal. We get lots of visitors, and they are all different, and they all learn differently, and they all have different ideas of what they think of when they feel comfortable in a museum. So comfort levels strongly affect how visitors feel about a space. Everything from lighting levels to how easy it is to walk through an exhibit, how much noise there is. I love it when Melika's class is just going at it. You know, they are enjoying art, and I think that is the perfect soundscape for this gallery. People can come and look at art, and they can hear other people enjoying art. I love that. Other people might not like that, but I love that. I think it totally adds to the space. Visitor traffic and flow. We had a fancy word for it called ergonomics, which wasn't pretentious at all. But that's how you move through an exhibit, and that can range from a 5-year-old who just wants to run everywhere to someone who's with a walker or a wheelchair, and how easily they can get around your exhibit. Speaking of comfort levels, what do you think has the biggest impact on how people feel about a museum across the board? The single thing that has the strongest effect on their experience?
Temperature.
Close.
Lighting?
Not quite. It's not in this list. You want to guess this? Bathrooms. Where they are, how conveniently they're marked, and how clean they are. If you are a single mom who heard from another single mom that XYZ Children's Museum was awesome, and you're going to take your kids there, you walk in that front door, you are so excited because you are going to have a break. Your kids are going to love it, they're going to be happy, you're going to be happy. But if your 3-year-old has an accident in the parking lot, and then you walk in the door and you can't find the bathroom, that visit is shot. And it doesn't matter how good your museum is, or how good your exhibit is, or how much your other single mom friend played it up. Doesn't matter, because you can't find the bathroom. It ruins everything.
Casey,
So, yeah.
has anybody been to the Seattle Public Library, the new Seattle Downtown Library?
We drove by it.
It's a wonderful space, but one of the things that is totally taken into account in designing that thing, and if you go on a tour, you get it, is how you handle the homeless. How you public libraries are the place where everybody goes, and so you'll see the guy over there, you know, Ray Bradbury typing his novel for 25 cents an hour or whatever he paid, and you'll see people that are frankly homeless. So the restroom, I thought of it because the restrooms are all designed because people come in there, and if you go up to the Multnomah County Library, people will walk past you headed to the restroom, and there are people who just sit in that all day and read, and there are people that are off on the weirdest subjects and everything. And the Seattle Public Library accommodates all of them.
Right.
Because I really, if you're ever in Seattle, go on that.
And it's a really special institution that can navigate all of those different demographics in one space. It really is. It takes a lot of work. I think children's museums are another space where it's difficult to navigate that, because when we think children's museum, we think just kids. But you depending on where you're located, depending on what environment your museum is located in, you might be working with a lot wider demographic than your target audience. Got a quote for you, because I didn't have another one. You gotta have one in the presentation. Empirical data documents that visitors spend little time at individual exhibit components, which would be like a single painting or a single display. Often a matter of a few seconds, and seldom as much as 1 minute. They frequently read labels, usually stop at less than half of your components at an exhibit, and are more likely to use trial and error methods at an interactive exhibit than to read the instructions. Attention to exhibits declines sharply after just a half an hour in your museum. Whether that's in here or whether that's in a big museum like the Smithsonian, you tend to start getting burnt out after a half an hour. And then we all know this, children are more likely to try interactive exhibits than adults are. If you've worked here as a docent, you know this because you've seen it, and it's true. If you're a curator and you write labels, you rip your hair out because you think, I worked so hard on how to arrange that exhibit, on how to lay it out, how to label it, and nobody reads my labels. That was the most disheartening thing for us label writers, was that, no, really? People don't read them? Okay. Fun fact, if you're writing a label for a museum, if you're ever doing that, the ideal label is 100 words or less. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, that slide is 83 words. So you gotta cram a lot of information into a small space. But balancing that is the fact that we still need long informational labels in museums. We still need them, because if you take them away, then the type of person who learns by sitting and reading a label gets lost. No matter how interactive your exhibits are, that type of learner will get nothing out of your exhibit. I think a lot of educators and even curators setting up exhibits who hear this think, okay, we have to have nothing but interactive exhibits, we're gonna take out labels, we're not gonna do any kind of words or anything, it's gonna be all pictures and hands-on touchy stuff. But that only appeals to one kind of learner. You totally lose someone who likes to read. They're not gonna get anything out of your exhibit. So to wrap up, kind of, I'm going to transition into how museums have kind of tried to figure out this whole learning theory and learning psychology deal. So when we look at theories of learning and how you can make that work in a museum setting, there's two schools for theories of learning. The first is that learning is incremental. It's adding bit by bit to a passive mind that reacts to information given to it. This is classic classroom teaching, where we give them a little bit of information. We tell them, today we're going to learn that red and blue makes purple. Tomorrow we're going to learn that red and yellow makes green, but for now we're just going to stick with red and blue, and we're really going to hope you get it. Okay? The other theories regarding knowledge and how we have information already, because it's not just about how we take it in, it's how we process it once it's there. We looked at two schools primarily, realism and idealism. Realism being the theory that knowledge exists outside of the learner and it is the educator's job to help them find it. Idealism being the theory that knowledge is constructed by the learner and we have to give them the opportunity to find it. Now if you look at these four definitions, realism looks a lot like incremental learning and idealism looks a lot like active learning. But there's a great chart that I'm going to show you that shows that there's a combination, there's different combinations of all four. Please don't freak out about charts. Like anything else, if you let them be meaningful, they will be meaningful. So I try not to make this one too scary. So regardless of whether we focus on the idea that knowledge exists outside the learner, or whether it's constructed by the learner personally or socially, we still have to leave room for those who learn incrementally and those who learn actively. So the four quadrants that we looked at in my museum ed class were didactic expository, stimulus response, discovery, and constructivism. Don't worry, I'm going to break these down just a little bit. And I'm going to make sure I have my notes here because there's a lot of stuff. So didactic learning and stimulus response learning are what my cohort called passive learning groups, because we imagine them sitting in their desk and thinking really hard. Teaching methods in this category tend to target the left side of your brain, the cognitive, logical, problem-solving side. And these kinds of learners are label readers. Some of you are this kind of learner. You really like this chart because you like things that are organized and make sense. They are often stereotypically what we call book smart, because they tend to really glean a lot from taking the time to sit and read. They soak it up, and then they really want to get that A in school, because A's are positive affirmation that they are doing something correct. And if they're not doing something correct, then they want to be told they're not doing something correct. And that reward, that affirmation that they're doing something correct, as you can see down here, you get a reward for learning the target response. That can be, and that's reinforced. Your reward is either by a tangible reward, like an A, or if an expert or someone who has an authority on the subject agrees with you. So it's very linear, it makes a lot of sense. Learning this way can be very effective, and there's a lot of smart people out there who learn this way, but it's also very easy to measure, because this is what we're starting to call teaching to the test. When you teach using this kind of method, it's measurable. So we want to teach to the test and make sure that each kid is getting each point. But then you lose everyone who's on the active learning side of the equation, who learns by discovery or constructivism. This shows us that there are different types of learning, there are different speeds of learning. These kinds of teaching methods engage mostly the right side of your brain, but also the left side of your brain too. The image that I kind of arbitrarily came up with is building sandcastles, because kids learn a lot about architecture and corrosion and wave patterns, but they also just have a lot of fun while they're building sandcastles. And when you build a sandcastle, you get sad when the waves wash it away, and then you get excited because you get to build it again. And then once you understand the difference between high tide and low tide, then you can figure out where you're going to build it. So this tends to kind of engage all sides of your brain. This tends to focus on the left side. Both of these are good. Both of these are right. Both of these are correct. The hard part is museums have to figure out how to reach everyone in all 4 of these quadrants. The other thing that we have to consider when we're trying to reach different kinds of learners, what learners bring to the situation through their personal background, what their social interaction contributes, how they are affected by the environment, and how they conceive of learning all play a major role in museum education. This chart focuses on the bottom part of this quote, how they conceive of learning. My last slide before I wrap up, I want to talk about what learners bring to the situation through their personal background and how that affects how they learn and how they interact with the things in a museum or in a gallery. So here's our nice little American stereotypical family. I couldn't put the dog, but apparently every average American family has 2.5 kids and a dog. So Falk and Dierking were Lynn Dierking and John Falk were 2 personal friends of my museum ed professor, Dr. Caston, and they published this book back in 1991, and it is easily the most valuable book I read through my master's degree. Again, $5 on Amazon if you're interested. Basically what they did is they outlined 3 contexts, 3 lenses through which visitors view their museum experience. And they all work together. So we're going to explore them individually, but they do all kind of wrap up into one big, difficult psychological package. The first context is the personal. This includes a visitor's agenda when they walk into a museum or a gallery, what they expect to see versus what they actually experience. Past experience. When you have a bad experience at one museum, you're going to tend to be a little iffy next time you go into one. How many of you have ever felt really uncomfortable in a museum? And maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just me. But there's this kind of stigma about museums, I think, especially art museums. When you walk in and you feel like, this is awkward, it's quiet, I can't touch anything, I have to hurry up and finish what I'm looking at so that I'm not bothering anybody, and then I'll leave and it won't be awkward anymore. And museums are trying to address that by looking at these 3 different contexts. Others' agendas. So remember when I mentioned the single mom earlier, who she heard from another single mom who's so excited about going to this museum, and that has a huge effect on how they feel about that museum when they go in. We all know that word of mouth is the best and worst way to do advertising for someone. And that people take that really, really deeply into consideration, especially with museums. We're not sure why yet, but more so than other institutions, restaurants and museums, people take word of mouth recommendations even more seriously. The important thing to remember when you're considering the personal context of a visitor's experience is that pre-visit expectations closely parallel post-visit outcomes, which basically means whatever they think of you in the beginning when they walk in your front door, it's probably not going to change very much, which is really depressing. But when people walk into your institution with a certain mindset and in a certain headspace about how you operate and what your mission is, it's going to be very difficult to change their minds. So most of our positive energy, most of our advertising and marketing about what a great place we are, that has to happen before they walk in the door. The second context is the social context. This isn't just how you relate, like if you have a family that all comes to a museum together, it's not just a matter of how they relate together as a family, it's how you relate with other people in the museum. If you come with your family versus if you come with your class, that makes a big difference, especially for junior high students. We discover that junior high students who come with their parents have a very different experience than if they come with their classmates. So we have to take that into consideration when we're doing school groups and tours and stuff like that. Communication falls into the social context, and I put it there. It's not necessarily verbal communication, it's physical communication. It's how the docent responds to questions, how Labels, whether or not you can read them. If you're 3 and you can't read, that's a communication barrier. You're missing something. Or if you're 90 and you can't hear, that's a communication barrier. You're missing something. And you have to address that when you want to make that context comfortable. The last context is the physical context. Visitor pathways are similar to the ergonomics, the visitor flow that I was talking about. But they can also include not just moving through the gallery space or moving through the museum, how they physically get there. Whether or not your museum is easy to find, whether or not there was construction on the way, whether or not they found a parking space, or whether or not they found the parking lot. How visitors get to your museum has a great effect on what they think of you when they walk in the door. All this stuff. We don't have a very crowded exhibit space, which I think is great, but you can put too much stuff in front of your visitors, and that affects their physical context. Finally, museum fatigue. I don't think I need to define this one. A couple slides ago, it said that your interest sharply decreases after a half hour. We've all been in museums where we're like, okay, I've been here 3 hours, I am done, I'm leaving. And you get cranky, and we all know that. So they have a word for it, and it's museum fatigue. And how you help your visitors combat museum fatigue is also a big part of your your physical context. So all of that to say, I'm going to sum up this entire book in one little sentence. Everybody has baggage. Everybody comes in with preconceived thoughts about your institution, what kind of a time they're going to have, and how they are going to perceive what you put in front of them. And how they process that information, you can only do so much about. This is just me talking. This is not anybody else. But my cohort and I had this great discussion in our museum ed class, and we discovered that the number we came up with was 85%. 85% of a visitor's experience, you as a museum professional have no control over. You can do your best to hang an exhibit and put great labels and do interactive stuff and make sure that your bathrooms are nice and neat and labeled and clean. But if someone brings in just a huge weight on their shoulders, that puts all of your efforts to moot. And so you have to try to reach each visitor on their level. On September 11th, 2001, in the early morning, the Met was empty. It was totally dead that day. By noon, it was packed, shoulder to shoulder. Everyone was flocking to the Met. Why? Because they wanted to remember what it meant to be human again. They wanted to have an experience that made them feel part of something and made them feel connected to something. And that's what each museum and gallery should strive to do, is to make their visitors feel like they're part of something, and if they can, try to teach them something while they're at it. And that's why I do what I do. That's why I love being here at the Josephy Center, because we can reach people on a very deep personal level, or we can just give them information that they're looking for and say, hey, go check out the history exhibit on Josephy, and they will tangibly read and learn things. And then sometimes a little kid will just want to come in here and be like, wow, this whole building is made of wood. And then you give them a spiel about timber, and they've learned something. Not what we set out to teach them, but they've learned something. And in teaching them something in a way that they understand, we've accomplished our mission. That's all I got. So
Okay, so when you were talking about in uncomfortable situations in a museum, I'm going to tell you about the Moma in New York.
Yes.
Okay, this is the most annoying thing, but back when I lived in New York, it wasn't an issue. But now they have these audible tapes where they put things, people have the recording of the gallery tour on tape. Well, they have no idea about the space around them and the people. So they're just like robots, walking from one painting to the next, running into people, not attentive at all. And they're all like little, I don't know, like...
Robot.
Yeah, they're robots, but it's really annoying when you're just casually looking around and there's like a whole shed of people going from one painting to the next painting to the next. Anyway, that was I was so annoyed, and it was super packed, and everybody's taking selfies with the
Yeah, museums have started to ban selfie sticks.
I can tell you're not dyslexic. I appreciate those tapes.
Do you?
Because I can't read all those words
Okay.
in a timely fashion.
I've been to a lot of museums, and I've also got several backgrounds, one of which is education. And I'm a very, very tolerant person, and accepting of many, many different learning styles, and I've taught different learning styles. But I cannot understand that people are interpreting a museum through their cell phone by doing this, going to each exhibit and taking a picture, not looking at the exhibit, not looking at the picture after they've taken it, but thinking they've had an experience by putting up a cell phone and taking a picture.
And that's a controversy. Right now, some museums are allowing you to take a selfie with the art.
So there's a couple of museums that have really started to focus on apps. The Met has an app, all the Smithsonian museums have an app, and they try to encourage kids, because they know kids are going to use their phones, or even adults are going to use their phones in a museum. So they try to get them to do stuff with their phone in the museum. There are some really wealthy museums out there who created apps where you can take a picture with a painting and then do stuff with it on your phone. You can make it come to life. You can tell a story with it. You can add to it. But again, I agree with you. That's not an experience with the painting. That's an experience with the painting on your phone.
The difference between having a painting in a book and looking at it and looking at a museum is just amazing. And I can't imagine somebody would want to go to a museum, have the opportunity to see it in life, and reduce it to what it is in a book.
Right. We didn't figure that, my cohort didn't figure that out, but that's something that each museum now is asking my kind of people. What do we do about this? Fix this for us, and we don't know yet.
Well, you say no cameras, you can also say no cell phones.
No cell phones. Yep.
Well, the other interesting aspect of that, I learned this in photography. They've done studies that show that the more pictures you take, the less you remember. So we take pictures to retain memories of things, but actually, through the act of taking a picture during the experience, you retain less of it.
Camera gets in your way.
You're too young to know this, and there's not very many books about anything that's real about this period, but in the spring of 1967, a lot of people woke up after they went to sleep at night and started growing hair around the world, millions of them. And nobody quite knows why that phenomenon happened, but the people that started growing hair also started taking LSD and smoking dope. And because of the time frame, all the people that you were talking about in the 1972s who were going to college, more or less, were part of that group, more or less. And more or less all of the people who worked in the arts were part of that group during that time. So even though the hippie revolution is sort of scorned by some people, it really was a big influence on the fact that these laws got passed in museums, because some legislatures were part of that group, and a lot of museum people and artists certainly were. And point two I'd like to make is, if you're an artist and you go to a museum, art museum, and you stand in front of a Van Gogh or a Matisse or something like that, it's revelatory. You know, it has nothing to do with anything except, wow, look at how he did that. And that's why museums are important. And that's, you know, this pottery here is really damn good. So people who come here, they say, whoa, look at that. And that's why this place is important.
We're gonna have to wrap up, because
Yeah.
Jacob is here
Jacob's here.
to talk to you guys.
You really did drop from heaven, by the way.
I have one more question.
We all-
I have one more question.
Yes.
What's the best museum you've ever been to?
Me?
The one
I was
that
actually
you
going to ask all of you guys at the beginning, and I forgot the best.
the one that you enjoyed the most and had the best time at.
I hated the Dallas Museum of Modern Art.
I'm not asking you what you
No,
hated.
I know. I did not like it when I walked in. It was this big block of cement, and it just like looked like the ugliest thing, but it was the Modern Art Museum in Dallas. And then I walked through it, and I spent 2 hours looking at one painting. So, I don't even remember who it was. That's sad. But I'll say that was my favorite. It started out being the worst one I'd ever been at, but I've never been so captivated by one painting. And it was probably the painting, it probably wasn't the museum, but I'll say that was my
Judge a
favorite.
book by its cover.
To walk into the Medici room in the Louvre, where all the huge Rubens are displayed in a building that's just, or in a space that's just huge. That's a hell of an experience.
I like the Pompidou Center, the Centre Beaubourg in Paris, because it was very modern. I mean, it just, and the space was in a completely interactive kind of way. I mean, you walk in and there's too many, a lot of things going on, but it's very interactive.
We'd rather bring the old typewriter downstairs.
Sure.
The kids love that old typewriter.
They do. They do.
Sometimes you get surprised. I went to a museum in Richmond, Virginia, and I can't remember the name of it. It was something about Museum of Sports or Sporting Life.
Oh,
You
yeah.
go in there and it's all the hunting scenes and the paintings that are surrounding the hunt. And I thought that was great.